Hello, welcome to Convergent Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. In this episode, I'm very happy to bring the conversation I had with Lionel Page. Lionel is a professor in economics at the School of Economics at University of Queensland in Australia. He's an economist by training, and he's mostly interested in decision-making, whether it's individually or in groups. He uses a lot of the academic theory, such as theory of decision and game theory and many other behavioral sciences. He is the author of the book Optimally Irrational, which is out now everywhere, and that's what we talk about in this conversation. We start by talking about an overview of behavioral economics, but not just an overview, also somewhat of a history of, what was economics up to for many decades, and then, behaviorism and psychology and sociology, they were doing their own thing, and how there was a kind of, happy collision here of worlds and ideas, and we get behavioral economics. We talk about Kahneman and Tversky and prospect theory. We talk about the evolutionary framework for understanding behavioral economics, which is deeply fascinating, one of my favorite parts in his book. We talk about heuristics and cognitive biases, gains and losses and mistakes. We obviously talk about game theory and Nash equilibrium. And we also talk about the impact of cooperation, the role of beliefs, and many other topics. I really had a great time talking with Lionel. He's a great person to have a wonderful conversation with. And he's, as he does in his book, and as you'll hear in the conversation, he has a way of explaining economic theories and ideas, but in a way that's really, I think, digestible for most people to understand and to get, and to see the important pragmatics of it, along with this kind of intersection and overlap with behaviorism and psychology, which is really nice. It's always a wonderful thing to see when people are kind of doing that kind of multi-disciplinary way of studying and researching data. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at my free Substack, convergentdialogues.substack.com. Subscribe, share widely. I'm also on YouTube. You can follow me there, share widely as well. And now I bring you Lionel Page. I am here with Lionel Page. Lionel, how's it going?
Fine, thank you very much for the invitation.
Of course. You have written a wonderful book called Optimally Irrational: The Good Reasons We Behave the Way We Do, which is great. I think this is through Cambridge University Press. And it's a fantastic book, and I want to talk to you about all the big themes. And so before we get there, why don't you tell listeners who you are, what your background's in, and what you currently study and research, and all those wonderful things.
Right, so I'm Lionel Page, in French, as you said, Lionel Page. So I'm born in France, and I studied economics. I'm an economist, and I'm interested in behavioral economics, which is the thing at the border between economics and psychology, where economists study how people behave in the real life, not just in their abstract models. So I've been working for 20 years in this area. Moved to Australia, so now I'm in Australia and at the University of Queensland. And having worked in this area for quite some time, I wrote this book to provide maybe a perspective which I think has been missing over the time in behavioral economics. There has been a lot of focus on how people make mistakes. I think that's a big contribution of behavioral economics, which is compared to old-style economics where people were super rational, making very good decisions. There have been a huge emphasis on showing that people often make mistakes and how we can help them. And so I wanted to write this book to argue that, we make mistakes, but I think we shouldn't push this narrative too far. I mean, if we're here, it means that our ancestors were not too unsuccessful at making decisions. And so there's a risk that a lot of things that we think are mistakes are actually good solutions to the problems that we face. And so that's the angle of the book, is to go through the wide range of results from behavioral economics and arguing that often a lot of the puzzling behavior that we observe are good solutions once you ask the right questions.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think that much of economics, from my very ignorant way of looking at it, is that economics does a lot of psychology and behaviorism and understanding people and systems and markets and how people are going to predict to do things or not. And so I think it's nice that we have this field. So maybe could you just two things here? Could you just chat a little bit about this field of behavioral economics and why you think it's important now, of this kind of crossroads of different disciplines? And what's some of the, I guess historically, some of the conflict between psychology, probably social psych, and to be specific, and economics, and why there was this conflict, and maybe how behavioral economics kind of tries to marry those two things.
Yeah, so it's a big question. So I'll progress, and you can ask me or cut me and ask a few questions, because it's a big topic, I guess.
Yeah.
Or, maybe a few listeners may be a bit surprised when we say that economics is about looking at decisions, and there is a relationship between economics and psychology, because maybe a few people think that when you hear the word economics, it's about banking, GDP, inflation, and this kind of thing. And that's clearly a part of economics. But economics, from the start, was a science interested in decisions, like how you allocate resources. You could think of household decisions, but government decisions. It's, once you have goals, it could be the government goals, but it could be your goals. What do you do in your career? Do you go to work at the university or to study at the university? Do you go to get a job? Do you invest in risky things, or do you save your money in safe things? So all that are about decisions. So economists from the start were really interested in decisions. And when you look at decisions, you have, there's two things you can do. You can first look at how people make decisions. And here you're right away in psychology. And the other thing you can do is to try to understand how people should behave. If you want to make the right decisions, what should you do? And so you may have a tension here, because people may not necessarily do what they should do, right? And this tension is at the heart of economics. And what happened in the history of economics is that if you look at the 19th century, so we go back a while back, economists who what we call the marginal revolution. You've got a blog called The Marginal Revolution, so it was impactful in the story of economics. Economists at the time were really interested in psychology, and they thought, people. The main goal of what people are following is to try to have satisfaction. Okay, so what you look for, you work to get a promotion because you feel that makes you happy. You take a job in California versus, instead of Chicago, because there is more sun, and you think you'll be happier with more sun in California. So at that time, economists were really interested in psychology. But there was something at the start of the 20th century, this what's called the positivist movement across sciences, where a lot of philosophers and scientists thought, if you want to do a science, you have to do a science which is based on things which can be measured and observable, right? There was a kind of pushback against metaphysics and abstract discussions where you can't, kind of measure, like observe facts. And that had a huge impact in economics. That is, at the time, you can imagine that 19th century or early 20th century, what is satisfaction? Can you measure satisfaction? We didn't have fMRIs. We didn't have neuroscience tools to go and peer in the brain. And so a lot of economists were unsatisfied. They say, we can't build a science based on assumptions about mental states, because mental states are unobservable. So we're just going to talk about things which can't be tested. We can't do experiments, etc. And at the time, there was a key movement in economics to say we're only going to base our approach to what we can observe. And what we can observe, one thing we can observe are choices. So, if I see you as an economic agent, maybe I don't observe your satisfaction in your head, but if I see you choosing maybe, a black car instead of a white car, then I can say, okay, I don't know what's in your head, but I can say that you made that choice, and then I can start looking at maybe having a theory about how people make decisions and trying to test it by just observing the decisions of people. And so you had in economics from the early 20th century to really the end of the 20th century, a kind of divorce with psychology. So the psychologists, the economists in a way expelled psychology from economics. And economics became very formal with models about, not necessarily about how people behave, but how they should behave if they are quote unquote rational. And so if anybody who has done a bit of economics would have heard the word rational. And what economists meant by rational is that they would assume that somebody, a decision maker, a person making decisions, would know what he or she wants, that these desires are consistent. So, you don't desire things which are inconsistent and which are in conflict. So it makes sense what you want. Let's say, for example, maybe if you're ambitious, and you want to be promoted, then you're not going to go on a holiday and spending all the time on a cruise ship and not working. That would not be consistent. Say, I want to do that, but what you do is not going to be conducive to getting what you want. So that would be inconsistent. So you know what you want. What you want is consistent, and you do the right thing to get what you want. So that's the kind of key ideas. And economists use kind of a mathematical framework to put that into to make predictions about what people would do. And because it uses mathematics, the nice thing is that you can have formal models when you make predictions, not necessarily that you observe them, but at least you can say something. That's one of the advantages of using mathematics. So now there was this divorce, but in a way there was a tension, because if you look at how people make decisions and you make assumptions about how people make decisions, the natural question is like, why don't you look at whether how people behave is consistent or is similar to your predictions? And so you had this move where economists went away from psychology, but in a way psychologists caught up with them. And so in the 50s, some psychologists, one in particular who started this movement, his name is Ward Edwards. He was the son of an economist. And he said, well, these economists out there, they're having a lot of assumptions about behavior, very interesting assumptions. And you know what? We should test them. So let's take people all in rooms, and economists say that when people make decisions, they have this kind of beautiful theories, which are mathematically written in mathematics about how people make consistent decisions. Let's ask people in these very simplified situations, whether they behave exactly like the economic predictions. And as you would know, and I guess anybody who has looked into behavioral economics knows, well, people don't. So that was the thing, that economists had built a kind of beautiful architecture about rational decision-making, where people are very good at making decisions which are consistent, etc. But when you ask people, the kind of what we call like anomalies or deviations from the predictions were like just accumulating. And so there was this kind of discussion, and from what it was, one was of the supervisor of Amos Tversky, who was one of the co-authors of Kahneman. And so Kahneman and Tversky started very early, I think, from that time and onward, a collaboration. Tversky was a mathematically minded psychologist, and Kahneman was a social psychologist. And they accumulated a wealth of evidence. You have these economists in their ivory tower with these beautiful models, not looking at data. And the psychologists were outside, just throwing evidence. And economists were initially like, I don't know. Yeah, you find deviations, but all models are true. So maybe people don't do it all the time, but that should be the truth. But eventually, the evidence accumulated by psychology just was too much. And so there was this paper in 1979, now one of the most influential paper in economics, the paper by Kahneman and Tversky in Econometrica. And that was super influential. And then progressively from then on, behavioral economics is the movement by which this criticism from psychology came back in economics. And eventually economists took them on board. So, now behavioral economics is just one natural part of doing economics. There was this kind of period of divorce between economics and psychology, and I guess now we are reunited. That's, if I would try to be very broad and quick, that's the way I would go.
That's great. That's great. I mean, I was definitely going to ask you about Kahneman and Tversky, but I think yes, I think that's I think that's right. Is that obviously in the late 50s and the 60s, behaviorism had its big, like big boon, right? That was the whole thing, and we've, kind of seen some of the negative aspects of only doing behaviorism. However, I mean, much of behaviorism is still used today clinically. It's used in economics. It's used it's used in many avenues, which I think is really really powerful. So tell us, since you brought it up, I was going to ask you anyways about Kahneman and Tversky. I mean, obviously Kahneman won the Nobel Prize. Um, Funnily, it was, he was a psychologist that won a Nobel Prize in economics, which is, I mean, I think always hilarious, right? He's he didn't win it for anything psychological per se in the truest pure form, if you will. It was in economics, but I mean, it was tremendous. And I don't know if it's from this 79 paper or if that was part of it, but he had this prospect theory and how this really is a springboard for behavioral economics. So chat about the theory and I guess the landmark paper and that contribution, why it's still useful.
Yeah, so, one interesting aspect of prospect theory and Kahneman and Tversky's work is how successful it has been. They were not the only one criticizing. So, when you look at the psychological literature, the fact that the economic assumptions were a bit unrealistic, a lot of people were saying that, right? So they were not the only one. In economics, you had Herbert Simon in the 50s saying that, and he got a Nobel Prize. But if you look now, Herbert Simon, even if people respect a lot of his work has not had the legacy of Kahneman and Tversky. Mm-hmm. And similarly, if you look at other places in psychology, you'd have a lot of psychologists who looked at people making decisions and making mistakes. But these works have not had as much impact in economics. And I guess I think there's one main reason, but there's two main big qualities in Kahneman and Tversky's work. First is that they really, you have this cliche that you scientists standing on the shoulders of giants. Mm-hmm. What they did is, it's easy to forget that the work presented in their 79 paper, or even in they have a famous paper in Science in 74. It's not just their work, really. So what they do, they really accumulated a lot of the previous evidence, synthesized a lot of the intuitions, and some of the key ideas that we associate with prospect theory, and we may talk about it further afterwards, but like the fact that we have a subjective satisfaction which depends on the losses and on the gains, or the fact that when we make decisions, risky decisions, we may treat probabilities a bit differently, whether there are large probabilities or small probabilities. One key insight is that we may tend to overweight small probabilities. So if I tell you, if I give you a lottery ticket when you have chance in a million, or one chance in a million to win a few millions, what is this one chance in a million? You may behave as if it's bigger than just one chance in a million, because in our brain, one chance in a million, it's hard to. You can picture the $1 million that you could get, and that you may behave as if you were overweighting this one chance in a million. But these key insights, they were present before, and I'm not saying that you remove, credits to Kahneman and Tversky, but in a way they gather these insights into a framework which is coherent, which is simple, and the key thing is that with a small mathematical model, then this model they can give it to the economist, and the economists they have this beautiful mathematical architecture to try to model how people make behavior, and the economists interested in psychology, in a way they could often just take the Kahneman and Tversky model and replace their traditional model with the Kahneman and Tversky model, and then continue playing with it. And if you know a bit of sociology of science, what's a scientist? A scientist needs to produce papers and needs to write studies. So if you come and you tell the scientist your model is wrong, but you don't propose a solution, the scientist says, okay, my models may be wrong, but that's the only thing I know how that I can do. And so you're not going to change the behavior or the theory. And the key thing in Kahneman and Tversky's paper is that they were proposing a very simple model that economists could use. And so that could change the practice of economics. And, that's the key difference with Herbert Simon, for instance, because Simon had very interesting ideas, but he didn't have he didn't propose tools which very quickly could be replacing the tools of economists.
Yeah, I think that's many times it's with things like that, people will collect things that have been there, certain ideas, certain papers, and then they put it together in something that's cohesive, that's then tangible. I mean, obviously, I don't have to say this, but so many people that are in academics, they just can't put it in a space where people can use it well for everyday things. It might work for academia or it might work in some circles, but it's how do we apply this, throughout different domains, and that gives it more power, especially if the idea and the theory and the science behind it is good. And so I think that's, a big thing about Kahneman and Tversky. You introduce also in the first part of the book an evolutionary perspective, which is very interesting, right? And I was very excited to read this. And so how do you feel, or how do you understand, I should say, how understanding evolution and evolutionary framework helps us to understand many things from for behavioral economics. Some of the things you discuss are biological constraints, incremental optimization, spandrels. So maybe you can talk about some of those things or not, but just generally, how does an evolutionary framework help us understand behavioral economics?
Yeah. So, as I said initially, I wrote this book because I thought that, when I studied behavioral economics, I started when I was a student. The classical approach of economics was still pretty dominant, and I was I was thinking these assumptions about people being super rational, etc., are unrealistic, and so I was really interested in looking how people really behave. But over the years, behavioral economics has, how things go. Like in science, you have kind of fashionable trends, and so. Initially behavioral economics is ignored, and then while I was became an economist, behavioral economics became very popular to the point where everybody thinks it's fantastic, and then some of the claims and the focus of behavioral economics were not too challenged anymore. Before they were ignored, then they become popular, and then you stop challenging them because it's like everybody thinks it's great. And because behavioral economics was built by this kind of movement of psychologists pushing against the model of perfect rationality of standard economics. This push was about, there was a big focus on making mistakes. So a big focus on the psychologists was to show to the economists that their assumptions were wrong and that people are not as good as making decisions than we should. So that, you have this push, which is totally understandable. But a risk of once behavioral economics has been successful, is that we continue this push, and a bit too far. And so I've for a few years, I was maybe a bit frustrated when the only way we describe what we do as behavioral economists is to show that people make mistakes, because as scientists, saying that people are quote unquote irrational, and you would find newspapers saying, "What is behavioral economics?" Behavioral economics is the fact that we have shown that people are irrational, but that's not an explanation. A behavioral science should be about explaining what people do and why they do things, and saying that people are inconsistent or make mistakes. It cannot be the end of the discipline. So I was a bit frustrated, and a key reasons why we can't be so bad at making mistakes is that we're here in the first place. Richard Dawkins has this expression, in one of his books. He says, "If we're here, is that we are at the end of a long series of ancestors who all of them have been successful in the world." And we're not talking about just your human ancestor, but you could do your mammals ancestors and et cetera, et cetera. And the world out there, is a tough one. So organisms have to find energy to survive, to avoid prey, and to find mates when they're sexual reproduction. So all these organisms and all these line of organisms which have been successful, and we're just at the end. These line of organisms have made consistently decisions through their lives, which ended up them being successful enough to survive and reproduce. And so it would be surprising if all that leads us to be systematically flawed in very important ways, ways that nature wouldn't find a way to adjust. So we may not be perfect, but in a way, by approximation, we should not be too bad. So once you take this evolutionary perspective, it leads you naturally to question a push which is too much about a focus on us making mistakes. And to be fair to Kahneman and Tversky and to many psychologists interested who initiated behavioral economics, they were not against evolutionary explanations. Like you take in the 79 Kahneman and Tversky paper, they mention evolution. They think that the theory is compatible with evolution. But what we have had in the field is that by design of this field pushing against rationality, we have this move, focusing on the defects, the defaults, and the problems of decision making. So I guess this book, over the last few years, there's a growing interest in economics in, adaptive explanations, pushing back the pendulum in the other direction, because it's been way too far in terms of us being very poor at making decisions. And so the book goes through all the behavioral economics literature and shows how often a lot of what we may think as defects are not defects. They can be good solutions. Mm-hmm. And not all the times, but often a way to show that there are good solutions is to take an evolutionary perspective. Mm-hmm. And an evolutionary perspective tells you, if ancestors had to solve a kind of problem for a long time, what would be the kind of behavior given the constraints which are out there? It could be biological constraint, could be that our brain is limited. You don't have an infinite number of neurons, for instance. Mm-hmm. Given this constraint, what would be a good solution which allowed our ancestors to survive and to reproduce? And so this evolutionary perspective, I think, help us kind of being a bit critical to this over focus on mistakes. And so that's, I guess we can talk more about that, but that's the initial angle that I take.
Yeah. No, I think it's important because it's looking at in a long history of our humanity, we're trying to solve problems, right, in novel situations, and we are also trying to develop and to derive meaning from them, right? And so understanding a long history of things, not just in the 21st century or in the 20th century, but what is the, I guess you could say, patterns and how we are or are not making mistakes or how we're able to work with them is an important lens to put on the decisions or behaviors that we're making. So I want to ask about gains, losses, reference points. You mentioned those a little bit earlier. Before we do that, though, you talk about some of the heuristics. So people may be familiar with this, cognitive biases, major heuristics. And so you can just kind of, set that up how you want. I guess two questions I have is, how do we understand where heuristics are important for behavioral economics? And how can we understand heuristics positively? Much of the time, we understand heuristics negatively, right? There's heuristics are these mental shortcuts we make. It's a way of breaking down processing so we don't have to do this whole long thing every time. We just use these good, kind of short mental shortcuts. But a lot of the times they lead us to so many errors. We make assumptions. We rely on stereotypes. It's a mess. But that's usually how people talk about it. But there are also ways in which it could be positive, as you described. So there's the availability. There's representativeness. There's what's the other one? There's like four major ones. I mean, there's a bunch, but there's four major ones. I'm forgetting the other ones. The simulation one, the anchoring, and whatever the other one is. Anyways, the point is that there's all of these different ones that we use, and so it's like, okay, well, how do we see them in positive ways, not just negative? And how does this help on the behavioral economic side of things for making good decisions?
Look, excellent question. I think so. Heuristics, maybe for the listeners who are not necessarily familiar, it comes from a Greek term, and it means a simple rule. And so the idea of heuristics is that, in the world, we may face complex decisions, complex problems, but sometimes simple rules can help you, navigate complex problems pretty well. Okay. I mean, if I want to give you a very intuitive thing, is like, I guess most of listeners would know how to be on a bicycle. But the physics of a bicycle, like standing on a bicycle, is actually very complex. So if you were an engineer trying to design a robot going on a bicycle, that is tricky. You have to solve very complex equations. But obviously, when you and me, we are on a bicycle, we're not solving consciously complex equations. We must have like simple rules about adjusting, our balance, depending on whether we fall one side or the other, etc., in a way which approximates the solution. So we're not solving the complex equations to find the exact solution, but we have these simple rules of adjustments, which allows us to, stay standing on the bicycle. And in our global life, we face very complex problems all the time. I think it's easy to underestimate or underappreciate how complex the problems we face. Like even for simple things like moving your arm and brightening something, like if you were to design a robot to do that, that is to treat the visual stimulus and decides how to, give the information to your arm to grab a glass and not to make it fall, etc. These are very complex problems. And one way to appreciate how complex they are is when you see little kids. If you get a kid of 1 or 2 year old, you see that this kid is going to struggle to grab a glass of water without spilling it, etc. And basically, it will take several months, several years to train the brain to adjust progressively, to get the right parameters to do these things, which is very simple for us now, but just to learn how to do it. And so in our life, we have very complex problems to solve. And the idea of heuristics is that often by following very simple rules, we're going to do pretty well and we're going to be pretty quick at solving them. And you can think that speed is important because if you're not fast enough, either, maybe you can be the prey of animals who want to eat you, for instance, or maybe other people are going to make the decision before you and you're going to lose opportunities. So speed is important. And having heuristics may be a good solution to instead of spending too much time trying to solve problems. So you're right that once you start saying that, you can focus on the positive or the negative aspect of heuristics. So the positive aspect is this kind of heuristics are solutions which help you to be fast and which are cheap in a way that you don't need to expend a lot of cognitive resources to use these small rules, these quick rules. That's a view which has been heavily defended, for instance, by the psychologist Gerd Gigerenzer. Called that fast and frugal heuristics. And the idea that they've been selected by evolutions for us to very quickly find the right solutions. The other way of like the negative aspect is to say, well, okay, the heuristics are going to be good most of the time. That's why they exist. But there's a price to pay. So, if you're not finding the perfect solution, well, there will be a range of situations, maybe not the most frequent, but a range of situations where you're going to make mistakes. And so using heuristics is going to lead to systematic mistakes. And obviously the school of Kahneman and Tversky, while actually agreeing in a way with Gigerenzer about the evolutionary nature of heuristics, really focused on the mistakes. And as I said before, it's because this area of research was kind of, designed as this kind of, maybe fight is a big word, but this kind of criticism of economics. So, they wanted to, there's no point to focus on how good we are taking decisions when what we want to try is convince economists that we're not that good. So you have this tension between, even from psychology, between Gerd Gigerenzer focusing on the usefulness of heuristics and Kahneman and Tversky focusing on the mistakes. And so they had this paper in Science in 1974 when they review 4 heuristics. And each time they show with a lot of experiment how if you follow these heuristics, you are going to make mistakes, systematic mistakes. So that was a big part of really the early behavioral economics. I would say now that nowadays, if you were to go in seminars of research in behavioral economics, I think we don't focus so much about heuristics anymore. And it's not that we criticize the idea. I think the interest of the field of behavioral economics has moved a bit away from the focus on heuristics. But historically, it was really a big thing in the history of behavioral economics.
Yeah, so with that in mind, how do we then understand um, gains and losses. You mentioned Bernoulli's error. Did I say this right? And then you talk about reference points and the role of peer pressure. Kind of introduce these concepts in the framework in which you're trying to understand of how we're making good decisions and how we're weighing certain things to determine what we want to do or not want to do.
Yeah, so Kahneman and Tversky's contribution, there are these two big papers. So Science 74 paper with the heuristics and biases, and the 79 paper, which is published in Econometrica, which is one of the most prestigious economic journals and very quantitative journal. In the Econometrica paper, they don't focus so much on heuristics, on this, what is called prospect theory. And this prospect theory, there's a few key assumptions deviating from the core ideas of economists, of how economics think about decision making. The first one is about, so if I was to say subjective satisfaction, economists at the time at least, would be disagreeing firstly, because as I said, they expelled psychology. So they had a definition of utility, which was devoid of psychology. So economists were going to talk about utility function, but people try to maximize utility in a way that I'm not even sure they would have said that exactly, but they would say that people make decisions which maximize utility, but this utility didn't have any psychological content. They didn't want to associate utility with satisfaction. So it's a bit nowadays maybe it's a bit abstract, but that was the key. But I think if we discount that for a minute, and if we say, okay, let's call utility satisfaction. The key idea from Kahneman and Tversky here is that when you consider what it creates subjective satisfaction, it is not the total amount of what you have. So let's say, if you're a billionaire, you're not waking up every morning thinking, oh, I'm very happy because I'm a billionaire. And so, as a consequence, you should be like pretty much always happy the same way, because every morning, you're pretty much the same kind of, you're worth pretty much the same.
In fact, you'll probably be more stressed. I mean, it's extremely a full-time job to manage billions of dollars. It's almost not possible for a single human to manage billions of dollars, much less millions of dollars, actually.
Yeah, you're totally right. I once heard an interview of a psychologist for, very rich people. Yeah. And he was saying, it's amazing how there's a lot of frustration and unhappiness. Mm-hmm. And people may think, why they're unhappy? I would like to be them. But once you're all them, like you have all the problems. Like,
you don't just have that sitting in a savings account. That money has to be active, and it has to be used and invested and moved around. And when you're just having that scale of funds, and then the risks become so much bigger at an individual level. And then if you have other individuals, or if you have other businesses, or you have other things, or different types of wealth, it's a mess. It's a full-time job. It's not fun.
Yeah. And so, and the key idea from Kahneman and Tversky to understand why they're actually not so happy. And because listeners may think, well, it's wrong. They shouldn't feel happy. Whatever they think is wrong. But its basic point of human psychology made by Kahneman and Tversky is that our subjective satisfaction is determined by a reference point. So we have a reference point, and we could talk about how it is determined. But if to start with, we just assume that the reference point is your current situation. So you get used to your current situation, and then every morning, or at the end of every day, you get happy or unhappy if your situation improved, or if you get unhappy if your situation went worse. So if you're a billionaire and you learn that your wealth has not changed, but this other billionaire suddenly is over you in the list of Forbes list of the richest people in the world, well, you may feel bad about your day, even though you're still very rich. So the key thing is that you must have a reference point, and then if things are getting better, you feel good. If things are getting worse, you feel bad, and this is going to determine plenty of decisions you're going to make. So that's a key idea from prospect theory.
So where do we have this idea of trying to understand where, so for example, when we're trying to make a decision, is something you talk about in the book, what's the optimal amount of information that you have to acquire before making a decision, right? We're going to make mistakes, obviously. That happens every day. And we have to factor them in, right? There is some aspect of factoring in mistakes. However, we do that, and also factoring in randomness and all these other things. So, how do we understand the right amount of information to make mistakes, and then factoring in all of these other things, almost the things we can't plan, such as mistakes or randomness or other things that are, in our environment?
Yeah, I think the key idea that we make mistakes and that mistakes are unavoidable. I think it's a key perspective to understand a lot of the biases, that lots of what looks like biases or strange behaviors. And maybe before I go into how much information we should get, this I could even say that the fact that we have this reaction to gains and losses uh, uh, can be seen and can be explained at the fact that we are going to make mistakes. So if you want to, and let's say you are going to make mistakes in terms of, if I give you different choices every day, like I could be telling you, here are two job offers. Which one do you want to take? So the job offers will have different characteristics. Maybe one is you have to move in a city which you don't like so much, but the wage is higher, etc. So you have to consider which job to take. And your brain is going to try to assess the values of these two things. But as you process information, there's a cost of processing information, and then we can't assume that your brain is going to make perfect decisions, like perfectly zoom in on prediction of what job is going to be better.
Right.
So if you make mistakes in a way, you want your perception, your ability to discriminate between options to be the sharpest in the range of options that you're likely to face today. And so this simple idea explains why your subjective satisfaction should basically be follow a kind of S shape centered around what you have now, okay, such that your perception about whether you're more happy or less happy is very steep across changes across the situation that you face now. So given what you have now, you need to be very sensible to improvements, gains, and to losses going down. And that will help you make decisions in the range of situations that you're going to face. Okay. This very simple idea explain the S shape from prospect theory as a way to minimize errors that you're going to face. So that's the first thing, which is a very interesting way of explaining why we have this S shape from prospect theory. And then you ask another question is, how much information should you take? So in the old classical economics, often the assumption was that information is free to access and free to process. So the economists were really thinking of humans as supercomputers, like with this huge, you could have this huge bank of perfect information, processing information was super fast, etc. And that obviously we are not supercomputers, so that's not right. So if you think that there is a cost of acquiring information and maybe a cost of processing information, then right away you find that there's a trade-off. It's if you face a problem, you don't know. Let's say I tell you, you have to choose you want to buy a car, and you're deciding between two types of car. Maybe you have a more family car, maybe a more sports car, and you have to think about the pro and cons. Mm-hmm. You may be hesitating because you don't know which option is going to be the best for you in the future. So you may try to look for information by reading magazines, asking friends who may have one of the cars, talking with your partner if the family experience is involved, etc. Maybe you can simulate in your head, what would be your experience in the future with different cars. But as you gather this information, your confidence between the two options, you may get more and more confident that one option is better, but you will never be 100% sure because you can't perfectly anticipate the future. So at some point, you have to accept the fact of making a decision, even though you're not 100% sure. Okay. And so this is a trade-off. At some point, you have learned a lot and you could learn even more, but you're not going to spend your time reading magazines about cars when what you want to be is driving a car. Okay. And so at some point you need to make the decision. And that very simple trade-off explains that we are going to make mistakes. And it's actually rational to make mistakes because it's not worth it spending too much time trying to make zero mistakes. You would be like blocked. You would not make any decision. So a key insight here is that, yes, we are going to make mistakes. And in a way, there must be a kind of optimal proportion of mistakes, which is the right thing to do in order not to spend too much time and in order to be able to make decisions.
Yeah, this kind of leads into the next question I have, which is you talk about it in the third part of the book about how do we understand game theory for human behavior, and you talk about various different things. So obviously, I had on the podcast the authors of the book Hidden Games. Is that right? It's Moshe Hoffman and Erez Yoeli. Good guys, really good guys. Great book. And we talked a lot about, game theory and Nash equilibrium and all of these things. And they talked about the behavior side of things. And so we we don't have to rehash all of that. We can mention it here just as a reminder. But I guess you bring up the idea of game theory. So you can just kind of remind us, what that is, but how that works here for fairness and that there are fairness norms that are existing within groups of people. And so when you're making these decisions, these things become important, and there's these, trade-offs, and there's these costs and benefits. I guess the question here is, especially now, I mean, I think we generally, I'm kind of, making this a little bit more specific here. In general, we think about, I think as a human condition, if you will, we like some sense of fairness, that fairness norms are important. But I would push that a little bit further. You can tell me what you think. That what I see with the current generation, the Gen Zs, if you will, that they really care. I mean, this is a central value for the current generation. This idea of fairness and justice, and not that it wasn't for previous generations, but that they're going to choose the jobs they want to do if there's a sense of fairness. That they're going to get into certain careers or go into certain programs for academics if there's some kind of fairness. So, that's more of a kind of a current applied sense, but just in general, how do we understand fairness, why the fairness norms are important, and how can game theory with these kind of these costs and trade-offs, how can this help us understand this idea of fairness that's important for all of us and maybe a little bit more for some generations?
Yeah, excellent question. I think that fairness the sense of fairness is something very intuitive. When you have kids, one of the first thing they start saying, when they start growing up is it's unfair.
That's not fair. That's not fair. Why does he get, more cookies, or why does he get a toy and I don't, or that one's bigger, or, whatever. It's not fair. Right.
Exactly. And as you said, so you start there very early on. So it means something to the kids, even though I'm sure you have not given them, lectures in political philosophy, right? So
right. Exactly. Yeah.
And at the same time, as you said, it plays a huge role in political life, and people demonstrate, people and participate to social causes when they think it's unfair. So it's a big thing, and I think it's one of the most interesting and insightful aspects of economics and game theory that we can pretty much credibly unpack all that and make sense about what is fairness, where does it come from, why do we have this sense of fairness, etc. And for the people who are interested in it, I think it's if they don't know about it, that's one of the things I think which will be most eye-opening reading the book. And, by all means, in the book, I mostly kind of put together intuitions which are being proposed, and for a long time and growingly to explain that. But I think I put it in a succinct way, which is easy to access. So it's maybe not a short story to explain why we have fairness, or maybe I'm not sure how I would say it very succinctly, but maybe we could start with the prisoner's dilemma. I think maybe a lot of people know the prisoner's dilemma. And the prisoner's dilemma is this idea that cooperation is not simple. So the prisoner's dilemma is, so game theory, maybe you asked me whether I should say a few things about game theory. Game theory is a study of people interacting with each other, and what would be the best way of behaving when you try to behave in the best way given what other people are doing. But the problem is that these other people are also trying to solve the same problem. They are trying to behave in the best way given what they think you are doing. So you've got this kind of problem of feedback. You try to do the best thing relative to what they do, but given that that they try to do the best thing given what you do, so it looks like you have this infinite regress, which could be impossible to solve. Mm-hmm. And a key idea that you mentioned in the notion of Nash equilibrium is that is this concept that you can actually have solutions to these kind of problems. And a Nash equilibrium is a situation where we both do something, and neither of us has an interest to switch. And so if we are in a situation like that, where neither of us have an interest to switch, then we can be locked up and the situation is going to be stable. So we can continue our life and just do that. So what I've said is very abstract. So I'll start with a very simple example of Nash equilibrium that we play every day. Yeah. So, in the US or most of the world, not in Australia, I must say, but in most of the world, people drive on the right of the road. Okay. Yeah. And nobody in their right mind would decide that today they want to drive on the left. In a country when you drive on the right. Mm-hmm. And that's because it's a Nash equilibrium. Given that that everybody else is driving on the right, you want to drive on the right. Okay. It's not that the right is better. Indeed, mm-hmm. Like in the UK or in Australia, people drive on the left. Mm-hmm. And if you are like me in Australia, in the morning when you drive to work, you drive on the left because you expect other people to drive on the left. And that would be a very bad idea to drive on the left. And so we are locked in this kind of situation where nobody has any interest to change. And maybe there's nothing especially good about this situation, but it's just a situation where I do the best given what you do, you do the best given what you do, and then, it's compatible. Right. So you have this key idea of Nash equilibrium. And the prisoner's dilemma is this game when we find that, unfortunately, often cooperation doesn't work. Mm-hmm. So, the usual example use prisoners, but my favorite example is a variant of the prisoner's dilemma when you have gangsters exchanging suitcases in a public space. So you can think that there are two gangsters. One wants to sell diamonds, and the other one wants to bring a suitcase with banknotes. Mm-hmm. So because there are gangsters, they can't sign a contract. They can't do a proper transactions. They have to do this kind of covert exchange, and they can't check when they do the exchange that the suitcase contains the proper content. So they have to exchange the suitcase and go their own way. So now if you consider this thing, and let's say they have to do it only once, well, there's an obvious problem is that if I'm the one selling the diamonds, why don't I just bring an empty suitcase, maybe with some stones, which are worthless, and get the suitcase of the other gangster full of banknotes. That would be an all-win for me. But then if you take the position of the other one who wants the diamonds, why does he doesn't bring a suitcase full of newspapers instead of banknotes and take my suitcase full of diamonds? Mm-hmm. And you can show that actually, given this problem, you only have one Nash equilibrium in these kind of situations, which is that both gangsters bring nothing. Mm-hmm. So that's the only stable thing, because if you were, if it was between you and me, and I have to bring the diamonds and you have to bring the money. If I know that you bring the money, well, I have an interest to switch and not bring anything. Okay, so it's not a stable situation. It's not a Nash equilibrium. So one of the big problem which kind of is illustrated with this dilemma is that the two gangsters they would prefer to exchange a thing. So they would prefer for both of them to exchange a diamond to the money, because that's why they started maybe talking about this exchange. They prefer that to the situation where there's no exchange. But because of the structure of the incentives in this game, they will end up doing nothing. And so there won't be any cooperation. And the cooperation is this situation like everybody would want to be there, but eventually, because we're a bit selfish, we'll end up not cooperating. So that's the dilemma. So now that's a key intuition from this prisoner's dilemma thing. But this is only the case when I gave an example where that would happen only once. Now imagine that these two gangsters decide to do a weekly trade. Every week on Sunday, they were going to meet and exchange the suitcases. Then now very quickly you can get the intuition that maybe they would be able to cooperate then. Because if on 1 week, I play this game with you and I need to bring the diamonds, if 1 week I decide to bring an empty suitcase and I take your banknotes, well, surely, you're not going to come back next week and the week after, etc. You're not going to continue bringing the banknotes when I'm not bringing the diamonds. And so by taking advantage of you today, I'm going to lose the opportunity of all the gains from cooperation in the future. And this risk of losing cooperation in the future is going to act as a kind of enforcing cooperation in the present. So that's a key idea from game theory, which was, found broadly in the 50s by many economists. And from that, then is born the idea that when we have repeated interactions, when we have repeated opportunities of cooperation, then it can become very rational to cooperate and to have this kind of together, if I know that you want to cooperate, I want to cooperate. We have reciprocity, a key idea from game theory. So that's a big piece of the puzzle. We have it is rational to cooperate. Now then once you have this big piece of the puzzle, how do you go to fairness? Well, the next step is to think, well, there's plenty of ways we could cooperate. Okay. And so we need to find one way to cooperate among the different ways of cooperating. So I'm going to give you another example, another situation. Let's say that, you and me, every day we cooperate in the office, in our organizations, and we write projects and we write reports and whatever. And we gain from this cooperation because we're productive, etc. Then the next question is, we create a pie from this cooperation, we create gains, and how do we split this pie? How do we share the gains from cooperation? If you were on a farm, for instance, and you work with your neighbor on a farm or with somebody on a farm, how do you split the surplus of crop that you have from having cooperated? One solution would be that every day we bargain. I say, well, today I did that much, you did that much. That's the way we should split the gains from our cooperation. And we disagree and we have to haggle all the time. But you realize that if we were to haggle all the time, when we cooperate together, there will be a lot of maybe friction, a lot of cost spent haggling. And so a natural solution which can emerge is that we have, among the many different ways to cooperate, we can have kind of fairness norms can emerge as a way to naturally agree and coordinate our beliefs and our expectations to know how we should coordinate. And these fairness norms, they actually act as a Nash equilibrium. That is, if you and me, we know how we expect to split the gains from cooperation, then we can agree without having to fight. And then we don't have an interest to change, because if we deviate, then the cooperation breaks down. And so fairness norms can be seen as a Nash equilibrium among the many different ways we cooperate. It's one way for us to agree of cooperating, benefiting from cooperation, and continuing without having frictions.
All of that tracks. I guess the one thing I'm curious about here is on the cooperation. So you can make a distinction if you want between cooperation and how that might be from interdependence, right? There's different kinds of, there's a nuance there. But cooperation has a dark side to it. Yeah. People can cooperate for negative reasons. And sometimes fairness is not the motivating piece here. Sometimes, or many times, the threat of punishment, there's plenty of good research on this, right? The threat of punishment or punishment itself is a big motivator to cooperate, right? And that's a kind of a darker side, but then people will cooperate to do really bad things to other people or to other entities, etc. And so sometimes it's not always connected to fairness, and there is a kind of darker side of cooperation. Where do you find this kind of fitting in here?
Yeah, so once again, it's hard to very, very succinctly answer all these things because it's a very rich question. But I think I can say a few things, hopefully, which address hopefully clearly the question. First thing, you talk about punishment. And in a way, punishment has to be here. It has to be a recipe, a part of the recipe of fairness and cooperation. Yeah. If you think that fairness is an equilibrium of the game, it is stable. So we cooperate, and we have these norms of fairness, which ensure that we cooperate. But for them to be equilibria and stable, it means that if you deviate, you need to pay a cost. So, and part of the cost is punishment. And punishments can be wide. We may think of punishment as some people getting out of their way to punish people, but even withdrawing cooperation is a punishment. So, if we work in the same organization, and one day I do something which is not nice to you, well, maybe next time I need your help, you will just not be here, or you will not be willing, or maybe you will not call me when you have an opportunity to collaborate and to do something. And that, in a way, is a punishment. So, but if I deviate from the norm of fairness, and you realize that, then you can withdraw cooperation. And for me, there's a cost of deviating, which means that I'm going to be, and that will be intuitive to listeners. We are very aware of this risk, right? Part of the reason we are very careful of being fair is because we know that if we are not, other people will be unhappy and they will react. It's not a free for all. It's like people are not pushovers. And because people are not pushovers, that ensures that we have an interest to follow the norm. Interestingly, these norms, they can be different across different societies. The key is that we all share these norms. So if we all agree on the norm, that's what makes it effective as a way to coordinate people actions and for people to cooperate. And it's interesting, you said there is a dark side of fairness. In a way, maybe I could say there's two ways in which you could say there is a dark side of fairness. One is that there's nothing which says, this explanation doesn't say anything about the fact that the content of these norms of fairness is good. You could imagine societies, in particular societies in the past, where norms of fairness, what was perceived as the right way of doing things, was very unequal, that people in modern days would find very unfair. You would have societies when you have maybe racial differences between people or gender difference between people that people nowadays would think is very unfair and very unjust. But if you were to step in the past, that would be the norms that people between different classes, for instance, or different groups would commonly share about. That's the right way of interacting. If you watch a costume drama from the 18th century, you will see how poorly some people of lower classes can be treated, and they would have the expectation in a way of being treated like that. Not maybe that they always like it, but that because that's the way things are done in that society, and that's the expectation that you have. So people from lower classes in that case would be pretty much upset if they are treated worse than these norms at the time where. So there is nothing which says that these norms have to be good relative to what we think is good. That's the first thing. And the other thing is that there is nothing which says that this cooperation has to be good even in a very general sense. So if you look at some of the cooperation can happen in groups which pursue bad motives, or motives which we is bad.
Right.
If you look at The Godfather, for instance, the movie, Don Corleone is a big reciprocator. He's for fairness. So if you are granting him favors, he's going to grant you favors. He's going to try to do the right thing, quote unquote, the right thing. And he has this kind of community of reciprocity where they exchange gifts. But obviously, when you look from outside from the society, that works from this small community, but there are costs for society at large. So there is nothing which says that cooperation has to be good. It's just a general explanation, and which can work sometimes to be good at the social level, but sometimes it can explain corruption, mafia, etc. It can also explain that.
Yeah. No, I think that's the important point. I mean, sometimes we put too much moral topspin on some of these concepts because we like them or because we like how they may benefit us. So, for example, many people talk about empathy, and empathy is fine, but empathy is not, it's not a holy water of sorts where you just spray empathy on people and everything's better. I mean, empathy has got there are pros and cons to it, right? And I think that there's different types of empathy and a certain type of theory of mind you need to have for it, and so on and so forth. I feel like cooperation is also the same way, right? People are talking about, well, we just got to be a cooperative society and the positive aspects of humanity, and that's true. I mean, I'm not denying that, but there's also these, we can also cooperate to do really terrible things to each other as well, and so it's not a panacea, right? And we make these moral attributions about things for neutral concepts or concepts that could fit in a quote unquote positive or negative cycle here. So the one big thing I want to ask you about here, many other things I could talk to you about from the third and fourth parts of your book, but the one kind of the last big kind of topic here is you talk about beliefs, which I think is really important. It's really interesting, how we have beliefs, how we maintain them, how we don't change our minds on them. We get stuck and we put all these things into them. So you can tell us about the differences between first and second order beliefs, but then also about how we have delusional beliefs, the importance of self-delusion, these biased beliefs. So it just generally, from where you're coming from in the book, how do you see the role that beliefs have, again, first or second order beliefs, and some of the kind of nuance with the different flavors of beliefs?
Yeah, so that, I guess, there are two different things. Yeah. The first thing, maybe I would start with the question about how we form our beliefs. We talked about evolution before. I mean, to survive and to make good decisions, in a way, you need to have beliefs about the world which are not too mistaken, right? If I believe that I'm a very good swimmer and I can just jump in the river and everything will be fine, and it's not true, well, it's not going to be fine, and there will be consequences, negative consequences. Right. So, when you make decisions, whether you want to challenge somebody, whether to go to do something risky, etc., you need to have a pretty good appreciation about the likely consequences of your action, and your beliefs need to be fairly accurate. But there is something which we need to be very careful when we think about how we form our beliefs, is that it's very unlikely that evolution would have selected us to have perfect beliefs. If you think about, science, people looking at the stars and wondering whether they are planets or gods, etc. Well, there would be very small, very limited selection for making the right decisions here. Because what are the costs of thinking that, you've got people living in the sky versus having a proper view that these are just, bodies moving because there are laws of nature. So there would not be a selection for us to have a very scientific mind and find the true laws of nature. Where there would be selection, though, is for us to be convincing. So if you think about, when you try to argue with people and try to form beliefs, what's important is for you, we are social beings, for you to be good at convincing other people. So the kind of questions that we would have to solve is, I would need to convince you that, I'm a good person, you should cooperate with me. I'm a strong person, you should be my partner in a coalition. Maybe I'm a very good potential mate, you should marry me. That's the kind of thing. So when our ability to reason was selected, this would be the selection pressure it would face. And the key insight here, which was proposed in particular by Dan Sperber and Hugo Mercier, two psychologists, is that this means that we would not have been selected to think like scientists, but more to think like lawyers. That is, we have a cause to defend. And that explains a lot of features about how we reason, why often we reason very poorly, in a very biased way, and why we form beliefs which can be systematically biased. Because we don't form beliefs, in a way, we're not designed to form beliefs to be true. Truth is good, but truth is a kind of byproduct of the fact that we act as lawyers. Lawyers can't say something which is completely untrue. So if you have a lawyer and the lawyer presents a case which is completely inconsistent, the lawyer is not going to win the case. So you need to be convincing, you need to be somewhat consistent. It needs to be somewhat in line with the evidence. And the better you're able to line up the evidence in a coherent way, the more convincing you're going to be. But, as a lawyer, you don't have to present the whole truth. You're free to, hide a few things or to downplay some things, etc., etc. And that's the way we argue. Like, I think listeners will have the intuition that when we argue with other people, you don't argue in a very neutral way where you just impartially look for the truth. Usually, you want to win the argument, and that's the kind of psychology we have. And that leads to things that not only we try to convince people, but maybe to convince other people, it's even better when we are convinced ourselves. It helps us being more convincing. And so there is a lot of evidence from psychology and behavioral economics that indeed the way we form our beliefs can be systematically biased in a self-serving way. So I think I'm better than I am. People think that they are a driver, that they are smarter, that they are nicer than they are, etc. And having these beliefs may make them better at convincing others that it is the case, and it may make them better lawyers of their own causes. And so these insights tell us that we should not expect people to be very accurate and having good beliefs which are true, etc. We should expect systematic biases, and that explains a lot of things in the world that we see today, about why people look at fake news and retweet fake news, etc., etc. Well, because we're not designed to be scientists, but more like lawyers.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. Is that we have these ideas and we get very attached to our beliefs, and it's very hard. And they're helpful and we need them, but sometimes we can go too far one way. All of us can do it. I've done it. I'm sure you've done it. We all do it at some point, and it's important to have some type of kind of reservations, or to be very cautious about some of those things. So I figured the last question here to kind of end on is, you wrote a book about how we can be rational. We can avoid bad irrationality. So I guess the last question here is how can rationality help improve us as who we are and how we connect with other people? And what are some of the dangers of irrationality?
Well, very good question. So look, I think we learn a lot about people. We're not as rational as economists hoped, initially. The model that a good way of characterizing the model that economists had in mind in the 20th century, in the 70s or 80s, is a bit like Mr. Spock. Somebody who is not nasty, but is very unemotional, very smart, and good at making mathematics, etc. But it's not really a human. So the psychologists have kind of brought back many layers of subtlety in behavior that was missing from Mr. Spock. We have emotions, we care about other people, sometimes we make mistakes, etc. So a much better understanding. I think the perspective that when we don't just focus on the fact that we can make mistakes, but we can try to understand why, that can help us, I think, advise better, how can we improve things? And I think there's a few things where, for instance, we talk about evolution, and some of the reasons we behave the way we do is due to the kind of problems that our ancestors had to face in the past. And so there are good solutions to past problems. But there are a lot of things that characterize the present, which are very, very different from the past. The modern times, the characteristics of modern times when we live in fairly impersonal urban spaces is really, really unusual. And our brain has not been trained or designed to solve these problems. And so there will be systematic mismatch in some of the way we proceed, which is going to lead to inefficiencies and costs. And so if we are aware of that, maybe we can fight against it. So I can give you a few examples. One example, for instance, is that in the past, the social horizon, the life horizon was much shorter. 2,000 years ago, or even 500 years ago, you didn't have banks which tell you, when you're 20, you can put the money in the bank, and most likely, not for sure, but most likely you'll get the money back in 40 years with interest. So this is not something that is easy for us to kind of intuitively process. I mean, we can, understand it, but it's not something where our intuitions have been calibrated to handle that easily. And another problem that we have is that the past was much more conflictual.
Yeah.
When you look at the past, a very frequent way of solving conflict was actually, murder or death.
Right.
In small societies, there is not a police and a rule of law. If you are disagreeing with your neighbor because you think he has taken something from you, next thing you know, it could be killing you, or next thing you know, you're killing you, and et cetera, et cetera. And it's easy for us now to, in the kind of life we live in modern societies, to underappreciate how peaceful and how unusually peaceful our modern times are.
Yeah.
Like when you look at societies closer to the societies of our ancestors, like you have something, I don't have exact numbers, but I think something like a third of people have been part of a murder at some point, or something like that, or have been victim of a murder. Mm-hmm. So this is huge. But what it means also that our social emotions may not be calibrated for the kind of peaceful time we are now.
Yeah.
And so, let's say you and me, we work in an organization, and it can be a very basic situation where we work in the same firm. And today you do something which annoys me. Okay. Well, maybe our emotions are not calibrated to think that we're going to work in these firms many, many more years together. And the right way of solving this problem is to, go over our disagreements and cooperate, because the gains that we have from corporations are important. And instead of that, we may have emotional reactions which are a bit calibrated for the kind of situations our ancestors face, where maybe one of the solutions was that, at night, one of us is going to come and try to kill the other one. Right. And so we can have these kind of high emotional reactions, which are kind of calibrated to handle this kind of level of conflict, which are not present now. And so when you look at modern times, you talked about the situations and the situation in the US, not just in the US, but in the US, the one is very conflictual, and passions and emotions are often heightened, and you can see that people want to fight, and maybe the level of maybe this is kind of the level of conflictuality that we see in emotions emerge as a consequence of the fact that our emotions are kind of calibrated to react to a higher level than what is necessary or maybe good to just work out in a modern society. Mm-hmm. So when you have that, I guess one insight is it may be good to decrease the level of conflictuality, to try to, counterbalance this kind of sometimes overreactions, because they are not good solutions to handle the conflicts that we have nowadays.
No, absolutely. I agree. I think there's this idea that we have, I've talked to a few people about this, but that we have these, these Stone Age brains in modern times still, and that we've updated and we've made a lot of progress, but at the same time, it was so many thousands of years where we did things one way, and we really how we've been doing things for the past 100 years, maybe not even, maybe just that. Is so small compared to all the things we've been doing for, hundreds and thousands of years. And that's going to take some time to try and really calibrate how we want to do things more. Hopefully we won't. I mean, obviously there's people in different parts of the world that are still fighting in this conflict, but, not nearly at the scale it was in, the Middle Ages or whatever. So I think all of that is super helpful and super important to continue to remind ourselves. And obviously that's what your book does. Again, the book is called Optimally Irrational: The Good Reasons We Behave the Way We Do. It's fantastic. I highly recommend people to go out and get it. And where can people find yourself, whether online or anywhere else? What's the best ways to get at you?
Yeah, well, I happen to be on Twitter, so Twitter a few things from time to time. So people are most welcome to come and follow me if they're interested. And otherwise, they can get the books in online or in their library. I guess it's available there. Oh,
that's great. Yeah, I definitely hope people do. This is it's been such a fun conversation, so wonderful. You have this kind of treasure trove of information that's just so wonderful to listen to. I really enjoyed, again, reading the book, but really hearing you kind of flesh out the ideas so clearly and in ways that I can even for myself that's not an economist can grasp it. So I appreciate the work you're doing and your time here, and it was wonderful. It's a really, really wonderful conversation, so I'm really grateful.
Thank you very much, Xavier. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.